This is a production of Cornell University.
My name is Max Pfeffer, and I'm pleased to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Development Sociology Department, the Peace Studies Program, the Polson Institute for Global Development, the CAL's Office of the Dean, CAL's International Programs, and the Einaudi Center for International Development. I don't think I forgot anybody in the list. We're all happy to have you here, and we're pleased to present to you our distinguished guest today, Rae McGrath. Mr. McGrath is one of the co-founders of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. He represented the campaign at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo in 1997, and he is Nobel co-laureate for peace. He currently works with Handicap International as the international spokesperson on cluster munitions, and he also serves in other leadership capacities with Handicap International. Rae also lectures at York University and around the world on the topics of conflict, landmines, and cluster munitions, and he's here to speak with us on these topics today. Yesterday, Venus Wu, who writes for the Cornell Daily Sun, asked me if you had one question to ask Rae McGrath, what would that be? And I said it would be, how does his individual biography lead to the work that he's so well known for? And in getting a chance to meet Rae and talk to him a little bit, I've been able to put together a few snippets of him, and I'm really eager to learn more about him as I've learned a little bit about his life. Rae spent about 18 years in the British military as a military engineer, and in 1982 he was officially recognized for his role in neutralizing a petroleum tanker bomb in Northern Ireland. After leaving the military, Rae turned to a quite different set of tasks. He turned to development, and he worked in many parts of the world, including Afghanistan, Kurdistan, Cambodia, Laos, and Java. His work also led him to do post-tsunami disaster relief in Aceh. But most of his work, development work, has concentrated on post-conflict projects that deal with explosive remnants of war. Rae has written widely on this topic, but he also has extensive experience on the ground, working with civilians that are affected by these remnant weapons. As we know, these explosives do great harm to people, many of whom are just engaging in normal livelihood activities, like cultivating their crops. Sometimes, as we know from news reports, the victims are children. In any case, explosive remnants of war create great costs for individuals, families, and entire communities. Rae's development work has included working with local people to train and engage them in the removal of these explosives. But one of the things that's most impressive about his biography is that his work ranges all the way from these local efforts to broad global concerns. He's worked with a variety of non-governmental organizations and governments around the world to promote international agreements to ban landmines and cluster munitions. Tonight, Rae will speak on civil society's role in prohibiting indiscriminate weapons of war like landmines and cluster munitions. I give you Rae McGrath.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's actually a great honor for me to be here, and thank you for coming out on what seems like a very cold night to me, but I'm sure for you it's just a normal run-of-the-mill evening. But what I have to talk about tonight has been accidentally fairly well illustrated by the problems we've had here. We like to rely on technology, and it constantly lets us down. Tonight, all it means is you're going to have to strain your eyes, and I'm going to have to work a little bit harder to explain what some of the writing says, rather than be lazy and just allow you to read it. The world is changing. Now, we hear politicians say that all the time. The way I see it changing is very differently than the way we very often hear our governments talk about it changing. And it's changing in a way that you may or may not be aware of. That is that ordinary people around the world are becoming impatient, with the traditional ways of doing things are actually setting out to take a hand in changing the world for the better themselves. Now, tonight I'm going to talk very much from my personal experience, because I can speak perhaps with a little more authority from that viewpoint. But what I'm going to talk to you about relates to the experience of hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions of people around the world. And to some extent, I'll be speaking on behalf of some of those people who can't speak for themselves, can't come to wonderful places like Ithaca, and are stuck in their villages dealing with problems that none of us would wish on anybody. My history, as Max so clearly said, when I left the military, began rather accidentally in working with conflict-affected communities. And this is a photograph from Mozambique of deslocado, displaced people by a clear remnant of war. But as time moved on, and we got to 1988, I found myself in Afghanistan, in a place, coincidentally, which now is considered to be one of the most dangerous places where your own troops serve, a place called Chamkani. And whenever I read about Chamkani now, it's in a very negative way. It's spoken about as a stronghold of insurgents, of Taliban, of basically terrible people. I don't think the people are different than the people I worked with. They're certainly tough people. They're certainly people who have their own vision, but that vision doesn't go very far beyond their own valleys. And just briefly, what happened was I was trying to establish with some colleagues a pilot project to clear the irrigation canals that had been damaged and get them working again, to get people planting crops again, to rebuild bombed bridges, and basically to see what it would take when peace came to Afghanistan. And of course, we didn't really know how long that was going to be in 1988. So that we could react very quickly and responsively when the Soviet army finally withdrew. Everything we did, we would build a bridge, and the following day we would find that the farmers were still driving their old tractors over the sides of the river to get to their fields. And we said, but why don't you use the bridge? We stood on it, we built it together, we drank tea and celebrated it. Why aren't you driving across it? And they said, well, because we're not crazy. The road on the other side of the bridge is mined. And I said, but why didn't you tell us that it was mined before we built the bridge? And they said, well, you wouldn't have built the bridge, and then if you hadn't built the bridge, you wouldn't have helped us clear the mines, would you? And of course they were right. There was some logic to it. And because part of my work in the military as a field engineer was to train people to clear landmines, I would have considered myself an expert. My first 3 months in Afghanistan taught me one thing first, that I didn't know, even begin to understand what an expert in landmines was. And I went on a very fast learning curve, along with a friend called John Hicks, so that we could actually learn enough ourselves to teach the local people to work with us to clear these landmines. We were going to do it for 3 months. That was in 1988, so I was a little bit out. Let me introduce you to some of the people in Chamkani. Perhaps some of them still there now. This is Team A. Team A should be famous. These people should be known to everyone who cares about development and post-conflict recovery in the world, because these were the very first humanitarian deminers in the world. Sadly, your country and my country might, in setting out to help them, might have actually ended up bombing them. What we certainly have done is we've dropped cluster munitions into the fields that we spent years clearing. And so my passion for this work began in those days. I wish, and maybe you don't, that this photograph was a little clearer. And I make no apologies for showing it. This little boy was a returning refugee. He'd spent most of his life in a refugee camp in Pakistan. He was an excited little boy, of course, when he learned that finally he was traveling back to his home in Ghazni in Afghanistan. And they received some warning about landmines, etc., before they left Pakistan. And they arrived in Ghazni, and everybody jumped out of the trucks, and of course the children ran off into the fields. This little boy, I'd tell you his name if we knew it. We never found out his name. He died in the frontline hospital in Ghazni. And he died looking at us, not understanding. And it certainly, had he been old enough, he would have felt that the world had betrayed him. And he would have been right. We had done. It was our duty as an international community to protect the lives of refugees. And we returned him to minefields. And he died torn to pieces by a fragmentation grenade that was made in Europe. Now, this kind of situation made me wake up to the fact that this wasn't just a problem in Chamkani. This was a problem around the world. And I began traveling to Cambodia, to Laos, to Angola, to Mozambique, to places sometimes that I'd been to before, but stupidly hadn't understood that there was a landmines problem, that the places were covered in deadly garbage that had been left behind, and made sure that the peace didn't mean the end of danger for the communities after the war ended. And we knew about cluster munitions back in those days. Now, definitions. Let me start off by explaining. These things sound complicated, so I want to spend 2 minutes turning you into experts on munitions, something perhaps you never wanted to be, but I'll do that anyway. Landmines you probably know about. Landmines were designed originally, anti-personnel mines were designed to protect anti-tank mines. They didn't do it very well because, of course, what happened was both sides knew how they were. They dug them up, stole them, and laid them in other places so that they were used against the other side. The problem with landmines was that landmines were buried. They couldn't be seen. They inevitably weren't marked, or if they were, they weren't cleared when the war had finished. And in the post-conflict period, when people began wanting to use their land again, of course, they were blown up. Their livestock was blown up. Their lives were destroyed. Cluster munitions, many people will argue, and particularly the manufacturers and some of the diplomats who are involved in negotiations at the moment, will argue they're much too complicated for people like you to even think about. Don't worry about them. The arms trade will look after these things. Don't you worry about them. They're wrong. A cluster munition can be in a bomb, as you see here, hung on the wing. This is a CBU-87 hung on the bottom of a of a wing. They come in all shapes and sizes. This is an artillery-fired cluster munition, one of the ones that didn't explode in the 2006 invasion of southern Lebanon by the Israelis. They used 4 million submunitions. And, of course, first of all, there was an indiscriminate nature about the attack themselves, and then a high percentage of them didn't explode as designed, and so they stayed to cause longer-term problems. Cluster munitions can be dropped, like these CBU-87s being dropped in the early stages of the Iraq War. They can be dropped by bombs. And how they work is this, and this explanation relates to whether cluster munitions are bombs, rockets, missiles, artillery shells, whatever. This is basically how they work. You have a container. The container exists only to carry the submunitions, these small bomblets, to a place above the target area. When it gets above the target area, the bomb opens up, the container opens up, and it allows the submunitions to fly free and travel alongside the container, which then falls away. Its job is finished. This is a cluster munition actually opening. During the 1980s in the Gulf of Hormuz, I believe. And then what happens is in some way or another, they fall down to the ground. Now, in each container, there will be a number that ranges from 5 or 10 to more than 600. In most cases, the average for a bomb dropped from an aircraft would be between 200 and 300. In the case of missiles, very often more than 600. Multiple launch rocket system, 644 submunitions in each rocket, 12 of them fired simultaneously. And then, if they work, when they hit the ground, they explode on impact. Now, what happens then depends on the kind of submunition. Most submunitions are what are called combined effects munitions. And simply what they're designed to do is to destroy armor by driving a hole in the side of the armor or causing the inside of the armor to flake off and kill the people inside the vehicle and destroy the equipment inside it. Of course, don't be put off by the fact it's anti-armor. This submunition can't tell the difference between a tank and you. And you can imagine if it can make a hole in a tank, what it would do to you and anybody who was near you. But also, just to be safe, most of these submunitions also have fragmentation capabilities. That's small pieces of metal blasted out at ballistic speed in the area where they drop, and don't forget there may be hundreds of these dropping at the same time. And then, just as an added little afterthought, most of them also have the capacity to cause fires. What if we did? You'd call it arson, but in terms of weapon design, obviously this is something that they see as being preferable and useful. There's one problem, however. It's my own view from my experience over the past 20-odd years with these weapons that if governments are going to continue using them, that what they should do is they should meet up with the enemy before each war and make an agreement, a binding agreement, that they will only fight their wars in large concrete areas. Because there's a problem with these weapons, that is that they don't work in soft ground, they don't work in snow, which keep in mind when you talk about Ithaca. When there is overhead canopy of vegetation, the little parachutes get caught up in the branches, and so of course they either get slowed down so as when they hit the ground there's not enough impact to make them go off, or they just hang in the trees and then fall down later the next time there's a wind. Basically, they have huge failure rates anywhere where there isn't a large area of very solid ground. And those kind of situations are quite limited. When you talk about multiple launch rocket systems, you'll see that there are very often tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of these submunitions fired within the space of minutes, particularly at the beginning of a major attack. The failure rates of this kind of submunition can regularly go as high as 20 or 30%. And they come in all shapes and sizes. You have here very old-fashioned ones that were dropped between 1960s and 1973 in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Some of them should really, I suppose, have been computers because they were made by Honeywell, among others. And you can see that a lot of them had self-destruct devices, and since this photograph was taken in 1995, you can see how successful those self-destruct devices working. We're still waiting. The reality is that self-destruct is all too often some child seeing it, thinking it looks interesting, picking it up, and blowing themselves and their friends to pieces. This weapon here is the submunition, the Blue 97B, which you may have heard about, was used by the US and a number of other countries in the opening stages of the invasion of Afghanistan. And you will probably have heard the problem that they were dropping yellow ration packages to gain the hearts and minds of the people on the ground. Unfortunately, they were the same color as the submunitions that didn't explode, with predictable consequences. Now, there's some very strict rules, some very clear rules as to the use of weaponry, and the major point made in Protocol 1 is a general one, but one that's quite clear, that attacks should be limited strictly to military objectives. And they should be confined to those objects which are, by their nature, location, purpose, or use, an effective contribution to military action, and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruling at the time offer a definite military advantage. And that is basically the grounding for something that's known as proportionality. And that is not a choice, that is a duty of every commander, of every responsible force, to comply with that. Before you make an attack, you must make a judgment of proportionality. Now, the principle of proportionality essentially set out to balance the scales between correct military behavior and correct military objectives, ones that were clearly justifiable in the unpleasant situation that is a war, but also which were acceptable human behavior. And I'll read this through for you because it's so small. Essentially, Additional Protocol 2, Article 51.5, made it clear, and what I've highlighted here, that it's wrong to treat as a single object of attack an area which contains both military and civilian targets. In other words, you can't just hit a place indiscriminately and destroy civilians and military in order to gain your military objective. And where there would be a need to attack a place where there were civilians and there was no choice, the only circumstance where a commander is allowed to do that under the Geneva Convention, under Protocol 2, is if the concrete military advantages gained would far outweigh any humanitarian cost. That's the law. It's not a choice. And Protocol 51 forbids the use of weapons, effectively, which make that kind of consequence we've just talked about inevitable. Now, I think it would be very hard for anybody to argue that cluster munitions, particularly used in huge numbers, didn't contravene those requirements. Just to clarify this for you, it's a pity it couldn't be bigger, because this is essentially a multiple launch rocket system attack on where we are now. And at the center of it, you could see that although one building was being targeted, there was a far greater area being struck. I'm sorry for doing that to you. I don't sit at home always designing cluster munition strikes on places so friendly as Cornell University, but it does bring it home a little bit. You can see that you can't just say we want to take out one building with this kind of weapon. You take out a lot of buildings. Now, civil society, what do we mean? And what do we mean by civil society action? It may seem obvious, but sometimes people tend to think about it well, there are people, tree huggers, left-wing types who go out and campaign. And then there are other people who do things responsibly. Well, of course, there's all different shapes and sizes of campaigning. And they range from this kind of campaign, which is a campaign up in Scotland, where you can see we managed to get the services of a giant 7-foot red squirrel. This was campaigning about the Trident bases in Scotland, but you can see that actually handcuffing the giant red squirrel and carrying him away caused some problems for the constabulary. But this is one way of campaigning. And of course, the reason for it is to register your disquiet, your dissatisfaction with what your government is doing, etc. But something more practical can be done as well. You see, what we found was that when we tried to argue against the use of landmines, we found everyone said, oh, it's okay, it's been dealt with. It's being dealt with under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW. Now, the CCW meets regularly in Geneva, normally, for a week or 2 weeks sometimes. And basically, everyone said, this is the forum to deal with this. Everybody's there, the manufacturers, the users. There weren't too many affected countries there because they couldn't afford 2 weeks in Geneva. And there was another problem, that the CCW works on consensus, which essentially you could say means that if one country there doesn't agree, then nothing happens. And of course, that's the way it went on. Every single country in the CCW, and a lot outside it, agreed absolutely that landmines, anti-personnel mines, were abhorrent, that they had to get rid of them. And then they added quietly, well, apart from ours, because we've got very responsible weapons and our military are very responsible in the way they use them, but everyone else must get rid of theirs. And so we began looking for something else. In 1991, a group of NGOs We met after a couple of earlier meetings in Europe and in the States. We met near DuPont Circle like a bunch of Mad Marxist plotters. There were 6 of us, and we decided that we were going to get an international ban on anti-personnel mines. And of course, we probably thought we were fairly mad at the time, and possibly we were. Happily, nobody dragged us away and confined us to an institution. Because what happened then was that we began using a number of very effective experiments, you could say. We discovered something called email, which was comparatively new then, and we began using it. We began calling together other NGOs and bullying them, cajoling them into joining us. And very soon, we started a snowball rolling down a hill. I would like to say we controlled it, that we controlled the direction that it took. Really what happened was we ran after it, and when it changed direction, then we said, yes, we meant that. We always knew it was going to go that way. But what it actually meant was that October 1996, by then, we had nearly 1,000 organizations around the world who were all campaigning in their own countries and internationally. And then we got a group of countries who agreed with us, who started a parallel fora outside the CCW and began a fast-track approach to find a solution to landmines. And there was never any question what that solution was. From day one, everybody was talking about a ban. The only question was, how did you define anti-personnel mines? Some of the things we did, we didn't realize how important they were at the time. A group of us went for Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights Watch, Asia Watch as it was then, to Cambodia, and wrote a report about the impact of landmines in Cambodia. And it wasn't a normal human rights report. We had pictures that the governments who owned them said they were secret, which showed how landmines worked. We interviewed soldiers from all the different sides on how they used landmines. And when we finally came to a treaty in 1997, we didn't stop there, because 122 countries signed the treaty. Normally, you would then expect 10, 15 years, perhaps never, where a treaty comes into force, because, of course, it needs 40 countries or so to ratify a treaty before it actually comes into force as international law. We began a process to bully countries into doing that by the end of 2000. March 1999, the treaty came into force, faster than any treaty had ever come into force before. And we didn't stop there, because we decided that we couldn't really trust governments to monitor this treaty. So we decided we'd do it ourselves. Now, I keep saying we. I'm not talking about the international campaign to ban landmines. I'm talking about we. Whether you like it or not, unless you're actually part of a government and you're limited in what you can say by your commitment to that work, or you're serving military and are limited by the normal limitations of being a serving military, serving soldier, then you are civil society. You're doing this with us. We monitor the treaty, and every year we report on the treaty. And we call to account countries that don't comply with the treaty. But we did something extraordinary, another snowball factor. We didn't just ban anti-personnel mines. We effectively banned anti-tank mines and anti-vehicle mines. They're still legal, but everybody stopped using them, or the great majority of countries stopped using them. Why? For the same reason that countries like the United States that didn't sign or ratify the treaty have never used landmines since. Because what we did was we demonized a weapon. We made it so unacceptable for right-thinking humans to use the weapon that the political cost of actually laying a landmine is too high. Basically, all the countries like yours which have them, with a few exceptions, will keep them a little longer, and then they'll say, well, they're out of date anyway, and they'll begin quietly destroying them. I would like to think that they will sign the treaty and do it with a big bang. Some countries have used them, but that's getting less and less every year. Something else extraordinary happened. Of course, we effectively closed down manufacture even in countries that didn't sign the treaty. Why? Well, what kind of lunatic would manufacture something that nobody was allowed to buy? So the Landmines Treaty worked very, very effectively, and I'd like to claim credit for all of it. But some of it was just the enthusiasm and the energy of thousands of people around the world and the support that we got. And we used some interesting tools. Instead of standing outside Parliament shouting what we thought, what we did was we thought it was much better to use the words of the people who disagreed with us. And so on the left here, you have what Colonel Sloan, who was the British guru of landmines, said that landmines would be used for. Wrong slide. On the left, you have an argument that pulls to pieces the British argument for continuing to use anti-personnel mines. On the right, you have the results of some of the research that showed that Fiat was very involved in manufacturing landmines. They were major stockholders. So we did them a favor. We did some advertising for them in Italy. And we produced advertising. We didn't charge them. We made films. And the one on the right, which tells the story of the bombing of Laos, I was honored and a little frightened to introduce that film in Washington with a lot of State Department people there, a lot of Department of Defense people there, and expected a very hard time. When the film had finished, there was a few minutes of silence. And then a couple of young State Department people made very tough comments, basically, saying, essentially, you're clearly a tree hugger. You don't understand what war is all about. They were interrupted, and they were interrupted by people from older people who had been involved in Laos. And they said something quite different. There was a guy there who actually flew with the planes that dropped these weapons, and he basically told the people who were talking initially to shut up. And he said, I unloaded things out of my plane that I'd never seen before. I didn't know what I was dropping. And that's why there's a problem today. And so we got support from extraordinary quarters, people who felt in some way that this was a release for them, I think, to be able to talk openly about those things. The left-hand side was about clearing landmines and the problems of clearing them. And as I was saying, we used the arguments for and against. We took the words of, at the top you have Jeffrey Best, who you may know of, who is an expert in international law, and his view of landmines. And then you have the former Master General of the Ordnance of the British Army saying that basically anti-personnel mines should be banned. He was in charge of them all. He procured them all. And then we had, as I said before, and I made a mistake, this was a poster we used which was really a glorification of landmines as a wonderful weapon by Colonel Sloan, this guru of the British Army. We didn't challenge him ourselves. We didn't need to. We used General Gray, who wasn't a death-bound soldier. He was head of the Marine Corps, the U.S. Marine Corps. And he said they were rubbish. He said basically he'd never experienced one single instance of anti-personnel mines achieving what they were meant to, but he'd lost a lot of his men to basically American anti-personnel mines. So we used other people's views. The people who you would expect to oppose us, very often we found supported us. And of course we used the Freedom of Information Act and things like that to get information. We're now doing the same with cluster munitions. Let me explain. Cluster munitions will be banned at the end of this year. I don't know if you knew that. The same kind of process began in February last year. Norway announced a fast-track process. There are now 137 countries, I think, who are basically committed to turn up at the treaty negotiations in Dublin in May. It will be a 2-week treaty negotiation process. But 97 countries, possibly 98, are completely committed to a ban by the end of this year. And there will be one. And the treaty signing will be in Oslo. This has come about by the same process, but we became more expert at it. We realized that one of our strengths was that civil society, because it was us who were clearing up the mess, we actually knew more about these weapons than the people who made them, the people who used them, or the people who were defending them. And we used that knowledge, and we used it effectively. And we produced resources and are producing resources, and I'll tell you where you can find all these resources at the end of this talk, which show where they're used, who uses them, how many are in stock, what countries have been affected by them, etc., etc. And sorry, here again is Cornell campus under attack. And once again, you need to remember that banning these weapons isn't just because of misery far, far away. There have been many of us around the world who've thought that it would never happen here. And of course, here you know possibly more than anybody else in the world that it can happen here. And we have to protect our future and our children's future by making sure that responsible weaponry is what's used. The key strengths, to summarize, of the ICBL and the CMC. First of all, communication excellence. That's not boasting. You saw a demonstration of our communication excellence when we were all struggling around the computer. It's my computer. I have no. It's your projector, my computer. So it's all our faults. But the fact is that what we did do was we took the technology like email that was available to us, and we learned how to use it effectively. We gave voice to a lot of people who normally wouldn't have. We put computers in countries that were affected by landmines so that we could talk directly to the people who were affected. We took them to villages. We set up satellite links so that people from those communities could talk directly to the diplomats in conferences. And we had a comprehensive, experience-based technical knowledge of the problem. And we were never, ever shy of using it. We had limitless energy and enthusiasm. It begins to sound like I'm patting myself on the back. I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about thousands of people around the world who didn't see this as a hobby. They saw it as a duty. And a healthy lack of respect for traditional negotiation mechanisms. I give up trying to remember how many times diplomats, particularly British and French diplomats, told me that we didn't understand how negotiation worked, that we didn't understand the diplomatic process. And my answer was always the same: no, you're bloody right, I don't. And if you think it works, then explain to me why you've been trying to get rid of these weapons, or say you have, for more than 10 years, and yet haven't actually managed to give yourself a mandate to negotiate. Most of the discussions in the CCW on cluster munitions have been a discussion on how they can actually allow themselves to negotiate a ban. So, you know that some of the civil servants around the world are being paid very high per diems for doing very little. Now, the caption under this, civil society action, may involve some risks, but making our voice heard loudly against injustice is one of the privileges and duties which comes with a democracy. It comes with living in a democracy. We're all privileged to live in democracies. If you don't use your democracy, it will die. And we've seen it happen in so many countries. And we shouldn't be lazy, because I think you have the same problems as I have in my country, that gradually some of the things we took for granted seem to be disappearing. And things aren't going to get better if you're quiet about it. Campaigning, civil society campaigning, is to some extent about making a noise. Now, doing a talk like this is always kind of interesting, because when I come near the end of the talk, I know that I'm going to get questions. And of course, the worrying thing is, am I going to be able to answer them? Is there somebody sat in the back row who is the world's expert in cluster munitions and spends his life in the back shed taking them to pieces? I don't care. But it still does make me a little bit nervous. But what I always like to do is to give people something they can do. If you care, there's something you can do tonight. First of all, there's some websites on there that you can go to. Now, I haven't chosen the Handicap International one because I worked for it, because I work for Handicap International. It's just I always remember that one because I work for it, and that gives you a link to all the Cluster Munition Coalition websites, and within half an hour you can learn more than you ever wanted to know about these weapons. Similar for clusterbombs.org, that takes you directly into one of the sites. ICBL.org, that's the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which is also part of the Cluster Munition Coalition, but of course monitors the Landmine Treaty. And the two things that you can do: speak out. If you think it's wrong, if you're with me and you believe after looking into this, I don't expect you to do it just from listening to me, but if you feel after looking into it that this is a matter of injustice that needs to be dealt with, that your government should be doing something in support, and not just that, that you can be part of the international grouping of civil society who are fighting to make sure that this is a strong treaty that's signed in May, then speak out. And what you can do tonight is go on one of the top 2 websites and sign the online petition. We're presenting, I think, what's going to be a couple of million signatures from around the world to the President of Ireland on the first day of the conference, just to boost them to make sure that they chair the conference strongly. And when I talk about conferences, one last thing. The traditional way of doing these conferences would be that we wouldn't know they were even happening, that a lot of diplomats from around the world, roughly four diplomats per delegation drawn from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Department of Defense, would fly off to somewhere nice, stay in nice hotels, and they'd meet lots of people who they meet at lots of other meetings, and they'd spend a week or so negotiating and chatting, and then they would basically horse trade away most of the important things and end up with a treaty that made very little difference to people on the ground. No longer. Because when I said the world is changing, when these conferences happen, we're there. And not only that, we have more seats than any country. We have equal right to intervene, to speak out. The chair recognizes the Cluster Munition Coalition in the same way as it does the United Nations and the International Campaign, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we use that. And we use it so effectively that at the moment, Germany and the United Kingdom and France, they think we don't know, and Canada, incidentally, all who are committed to this process are trying to convince Ireland that really you don't need so many civil society people in there, because I think we lower the tone of the place. These characters with earrings and basically scruffy chaps, they wear boots with their suits and things like that, shouldn't be allowed in. Well, we aren't going away. And we aren't just inside, we're outside. So if we don't get them inside, we get them outside. What I'd ask you to do is do a bit of research and join us and be part of the new world order that really will work. Thank you.
To agree to take some questions, so I'll let you field.
Okay, no more than 2 hours, please.
This isn't a question, but I have given a little support to Handicap International, and I got the literature, and I thought, well, what can we do about this? So I thought, well, maybe I should send some of this literature to the wife of the world's greatest terrorist. So I put it together, and I put Mrs. Laura Bush.
I was going to say, I presume that's some kind of political comment.
On the envelope, and I sent her a little note. And this was a few weeks ago. And just this last week, I did receive an acknowledgement from the Secretary of the Secretary saying, thank you for your information. We appreciate it. And we have passed the material on to appropriate government departments. But I also wrote in my note that if she couldn't change the policy of this government, at least she could give some money towards Handicap International to help these poor people that are blown up if they've survived.
Well, I'll be looking forward to the check. I would say one thing in response to that, and this is very important. We all have our political beliefs, and we all feel strongly one way or the other. But one thing is really important to recognize, that a lot of the people who support this campaign are great supporters of the right wing, of the left wing, of the Democrats, of the Republicans. this is a very, what you could call a broad church campaign. And one of the interesting things about it is that some of our greatest breakthroughs over the years, both in landmines and in cluster munitions, has been, one, that we were never disarmament campaigns. A lot of the people in the campaign believed in disarmament, but they stuck to the fact there's a very special reason to get rid of this weapon. And what we also did was we tried to make key points, and that's why I'd urge you, as you've done, to look at what's on the websites, to respond to it, but also not to give up when you get that first reply. By all means, send it to me at Handicap International. And what we spend a lot of time doing is sending ideas about how you might respond. So if, as very often happens, they come back with some bland reply saying, oh, these are very responsible weapons that we use, it's the ones that others use, or it's the way they're used, we'll bring you chapter and verse and send it to you, point you in the right direction where you can get the answers so you can go back. I mean, keep hitting them, and the thing to remember is, within the democracy, the biggest weapon you have is to threaten votes. Yep.
The reply could have applied to any matter that I said.
Yep.
So it was not specific.
Yep.
It was just a...
That's probably more a statement about the lady you wrote to than about the policy of the government. What I would tend to do is to send letters to particularly your local representative, you know, your state representatives, your county representatives, whatever system that you feel you can influence most, because you put them in a position where perhaps they have to ask questions of the Department of State, of the Department of Defense, and when you get enough of them doing it, it becomes quite annoying. I remember Bobby Muller from Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation saying that there was somebody from the Department of State who admitted that halfway through the Landmines campaign, they actually had to open a new office in there and staff an office just to deal with the issues that were being brought up in this country about landmines. So, I mean, there are ways to bring pressure, and I'd really keep trying, keep writing. Yes, sorry.
One question on the political economy of the production of arms. We know it's an enormous, we cannot even grasp the enormity of the economic power of whoever is producing these arms. So which countries and which companies? I know I can do the research, but what do you do about it? You put an example of Fiat, but what else when you find out who's producing?
Okay, there's a few things we've been doing.
Please repeat the question.
Sorry. What was being asked was what we did essentially about the people who are making them, about the arms industry, the people who produce these weapons. There's been a variety of different ones. Let me give you an example which I love talking about, I'm sorry, because it's like one of those dreams that happens sometimes. In relation to landmines, we started the campaign in Italy, and we put it in Brescia, the seminar, because that's the center of the Italian arms trade. And the idea was to bring home to people exactly the problem that was being caused by Italian landmines. Well, when I got up to talk, I saw that the whole front row was filled with what you might call very, how to put this politely, very tough and quite well-built Italian ladies, all who worked at Valsella making landmines. And they'd been encouraged by their management to come over there and basically break up the meeting because these people are trying to steal your jobs from you. Well, they sat through the presentation, and it was quite a horrific presentation, because what was happening in Kurdistan, and about 90% of the mines were Italian, because the companies involved had sold both to the Iraqis and the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War. And at the end of the presentation, this lady who was leading this group leapt up, and I thought, okay, you're going to die. None of your military training is going to help you here. This is the end of your life. She leapt on the stage, went straight past me to the panel, and the union convener from Valcella was on the panel. She took him by his lapels and pulled him over the front and began shouting at him. What was wonderful was in my earpiece, this very calm Italian translator was translating the best version of the obscenities that were being given to this guy. Why didn't you tell us? The outcome of that was that we joined together with these people who basically had worked believing that they were making weapons for the Italian army. They occupied the factory. They closed it down. They occupied it for a number of years. Closed down production, of course. Fiat withdrew their money from it because they didn't want to be linked to it. And when we got the Nobel Peace Prize, the first thing we did was we wrote to the president, Italian president, prime minister, to the Pope, to everyone else, and said, look, the bank which actually owns this company, which is trying to put it into bankruptcy, is majority shareholders are the government of Italy. Why don't you write off the debts and fund these people to do what they want to do? And since 1998, Valcella has been making green, environmentally friendly buses instead of landmines. And I thought that was just one of the most wonderful stories. To turn to cluster munitions, what I would say is that we have this, a couple of things happening here. One is that Textron are the new manufacturers of cluster munitions. And they advertise, as do all arms companies, in these closed publications, which normally only governments, Department of Defense, and arms manufacturers buy, because your average person who's got something useful to do with their life doesn't go out and buy Jane's Defense Weekly. But we monitor all the adverts that go in them. And of course, we've got files in my attic, which is where I work from, which is not a very organized place. I have files of adverts going back for several years. And we have the original adverts from Alliant Tech Systems for the Blue 97B, that yellow thing with the parachute, which they explain what a great weapon it is, how it doesn't cause post-conflict problems, etc. So we can show that's not true. But what we found recently was something very interesting. It was Textron agreeing with us in an advert, saying, look, the stuff that was made by Alliant Tech Systems was rubbish, and it caused all these problems. But what we're developing now is much better. Well, I'm going to have some surprising film for them in May, which will show some films from Iraq that they thought nobody had, and we do now, to show that even that's not right. But in terms of campaigning, that's a wonderful step, because we have the arms industry agreeing with us that these weapons don't work, even when they claim in their adverts that they do. So we think that's nice. They've joined and they're helping us. So as I talked about earlier, what we're going to do is do some advertising for them just before May. We might do some international advertising for them. The other thing that we've done, which you may think about here, it's not straightforward, but it is interesting. Handicap International and Amnesty France found out that AXA, the insurance company, one of the biggest insurance companies in Europe and possibly in the world, invested heavily in cluster munitions manufacturers. And so what we did was we very publicly withdrew and said that we were breaking our contract. And of course their first response was the lawyers said, well, you know, you can't break your contract, you have a contract. And we said, great, sue us. You know, please. We'll actually pay your lawyers if you'll sue us. And of course, what's happened now is quite extraordinary because AXA have actually started the process. They've hired people and are working with us to find ways of finding out how they can make sure they're not investing in that kind of weaponry at all. Not only that, but there's now been a knock-on effect for other insurance companies because they're worried that what AXA have done is going to leave them vulnerable. Because, of course, AXA now will boast about the fact that they are ethically a lot better than the others. And so this is beginning to be another snowball that's rolling. And it's great because the insurance companies are paying for this themselves. There's a number of other things going on like that. And this is what I call peripheral campaigning. You get a group of people who are expert in some field within the campaign. They go off and do their thing. They come back to us when they need technical advice, and then they chase that track. And we've got, I don't know, so many things happening at the same time. But we are addressing those things. But the major thing, to be honest, with cluster munitions manufacturers, we know that most of them are already talking about pulling out. They don't want to manufacture cluster munitions. Why? If we get an international ban, who's going to buy them? If you're Textron and you can only sell to the US government, there's not going to be enough business there. And it's high risk. The other thing we've been doing is you may know that that the auditors of any company which has a quoted company which has stockholders, they have an obligation to inform the shareholders if there is a considerable risk to the profitability of the company. And so as a public duty, we always contact the auditors of those companies to let them know that their profits are at risk because we're in the process of getting a ban on cluster munitions. And so all these things are working. Okay? Yeah, sorry, this gentleman here.
When you're writing to a Congress member who seems to be a little bit friendly, it's often helpful to provide that person with some ammunition to answer critics.
Yes.
When you're speaking out yourself, the same thing applies. So my question is this. Does your website have some quotation from that Marine general?
Yes, lots of that. And not only that, we'll leave these slides. They will be available, through Cornell. There's a couple of limitations on some of the photographs I've used because of they would need clearance if they were going to be used more widely because they've been kind of donated to us free by the photographer. But most of it, and certainly all those quotations, they're free to use. It's General Alfred J. Gray, Jr., who I don't think is a shrinking violet or a tree hugger. He actually sounds like he could, he could sort of tear you to pieces with his bare hands. So he's somebody good to have on your side. Okay, yes, sir?
My eyesight is not good enough to read your suggested websites, and I wonder if you would spell out for us the one or two names
Okay, what we'll do is we'll write them down and we'll make sure, perhaps we can make sure they get onto a website here at Cornell or something like that.
Ray, there's some Google. If you just put some words into Google, will you?
Yeah, all these things come up automatically with Google anyway. But listen, what I'll do is I'll scribble these things down anyway, and it'll only take 2 minutes, and before you leave, if you're interested, grab it and copy them or whatever. Okay? Somebody up the back, this gentleman here, yeah?
I guess you've been focusing a lot on Western European and North American countries preventing landmines. As the balance of power shifted towards Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia, can you tell us a little bit about your efforts in those countries as well?
Yeah, sure. I focus on Europe and the United States because of the obvious relevance here. One of the extraordinary things about this process is that, particularly the cluster munitions process, is that in the conference hall, in the diplomatic side, it's being far more driven by affected countries. They've gained a lot of strength from what they learned during the landmine process. During the landmine process, it's no secret, your government in Oslo, in the final negotiations, had what they called breakfast meetings with most of the African states particularly, because they had worked out that the African states, they could be bought, threatened, whatever, and they would close the whole thing down by getting the African states to pull out and move back to the CCW. They got a shock. The African states stood together and basically, quite rudely, told your governments what to do, which I thought was good enough then. But what's happened now is quite extraordinary. First of all those countries come to these conferences. Now, normally it never used to happen. Why did they come to the conferences? Well, because we found ways of working with governments like Norway and the United Nations to pay for them to come. We thought it's a human right. And so Norway, among other countries, funds those countries to attend the conferences. But the African governments and the cluster munition affected countries like Laos, Cambodia, are so strong now that there's something quite extraordinary happen. In May, we have a feeling that probably Germany and the UK and France are going to try and weaken the treaty by bringing in all sorts of complex arguments, particularly interoperability, which basically means how can we sign this treaty and let the US carry on doing what they want to do with cluster munitions and storing them in UK, etc., etc. We're not that bothered about it. And I'll tell you why. The rules of this conference in May will be vote, a two-thirds vote. And even with the countries that are signed up now, we've got two-thirds every time. Why? Because Asian and African countries are solidly behind the ban. And they're loving it. Now when the head of the UK delegation stands up, he always sort of sounds like he's some throwback to British colonial days, and he's just about to read the Riot Act, and the troops are behind him ready to fire on the rebelling natives. It doesn't go down well. And it's, to be honest, for me, it's quite an empowering experience to see these countries that normally used to, if they were there at all, used to sit quietly and watch and listen and basically do what they were told. It's very different, and I think that's going to change the way diplomacy happens in other fora as well. But there's also something else, that what the campaign does a lot is make sure that things like translations for the Francophone countries, for Lusophone countries, for Spanish-speaking countries, are that they're given translations in good time, that they're brief, that they know how the process works, because very often their diplomats aren't used to the process. And basically, we also run courses, essentially for diplomats on how to stuff the old colonial powers. So that's really... there are countries like Russia, China, essentially the same as the United States. They're not part of the process. China, because, of course, they don't believe that NGOs should exist. Although China have engaged in dialogue informally quite a few times now with us. Russia, essentially, because of this, while the US maintains its position on these things, there's no way that Russia is going to change, and I suppose vice versa to some extent. And then you've got a number of countries. Pardon? I think to some extent it's a mixture. One is that they listen to the military and believe the military regardless of what's being said. Some of it is antagonism to the process. It's very difficult to tell because, of course, to be honest, we're fairly happy that those countries are outside the process. If they're in it, they would be troublemaking. We can limit their troublemaking, and we've seen from the Landmine Treaty that there are other ways of banning a weapon than actually getting people to sign a treaty. If the treaty is universalized sufficiently, it will become very, very difficult for the US, Russia, and China to use those weapons with impunity, and particularly not in multinational humanitarian interventions, etc. Sorry, can I go back to the gentleman there who...
So you argued in favor of banning all landmines completely. How do we know that we won't need area deterrence munitions in the future? We've used them successfully in Korea, Egypt during World War II, the U.S. during the First Gulf War used them successfully in Saudi Arabia, preventing Iraq from moving south. Is there a future banning out international for area deterrence munitions, keeping the enemy out of areas?
Okay. Well, it's great to see somebody who doesn't agree with me. I'm always happy when that happens. First of all, you're wrong, or I think you're wrong. In Korea, the effective use of landmines. If you call blowing up a lot of your own troops with your own weapons, then yes, they were very effective both for the Chinese and for the U.S. and the UN alliance. That's what we did. There wasn't a single battle where landmines could be given as the success, the swing point in the battle. The reason is very simple, and the reason is this, that you lay a minefield, it only is any good at all if you can cover it with effective fire. From Korea onwards, that meant that you needed to have superior air power. If you had superior air power, I'm sorry, but you didn't need your minefield. You could dig a ditch and cause the same kind of choke point on the battlefield. Secondly, you mentioned Egypt. Well, that's very interesting because if you take Alamein, I've been there and you can go there now and you can see that in actual fact the German minefields ran into the British minefields, so that the German and British minefields became one minefield. Who was that serving? It certainly wasn't serving either the British or the Germans, and it certainly hasn't served the nomadic people who regularly get blown up. I'd say the same for Libya, incidentally, where that's also a major problem. You can then come further forward. The most quoted one, I actually asked some US military experts in a conference last year to quote me an absolute success for the use of cluster munitions. Well, they had to go back to the first Gulf War, which makes you wonder what happened in the second Gulf War when they used more of them, and what happened in Afghanistan, etc., if they had to go that far to find a successful use of them. And they said that the successful use was that they laid down cluster munitions very, very effectively by largely MLRS in the first hours of the battle. Well, you'll never know because, of course, the fact was that the frontline troops that they thought were hardened Republican soldiers turned out to be largely people who didn't want to be there. A lot of them were Kurds, for instance. They wanted out of there. They wanted to surrender. Sadly, some of them weren't allowed to surrender. But there's no evidence whatsoever that cluster munitions were in any way a turning point in that battle. The battle was won effectively when it became clear that there was no strong resistance from the majority of Iraqi troops. I'd add to that there was something more interesting in as much as the use of cluster munitions in battles like that means that you then have to advance through areas which you've actually carpeted with unexploded and very unstable cluster munitions. The US hasn't released yet, I'm sure they're getting round to it, the number of alliance troops who were killed by their own cluster munitions, because they would have had to be their own cluster munitions during that initial advance into Iraq. Certainly I can say about Kosovo, humanitarian intervention. The US, UK, and the Dutch used cluster munitions of various different kinds. You know what the first British military casualties were in Kosovo? They were actually British soldiers from the Gurkha Engineer Regiment who had never dealt with cluster munitions before, that were removing unexploded US cluster munitions, Blue 97Bs, out of a school playground so that children wouldn't play with them. They got blown up by them. These weapons, I'm not against weapons, and when I was in the military, I would use whatever was given to me. And it's our job as civil society not to blame the military when things go wrong, but to make sure that we give them responsible weaponry. Neither do I kind of blame the military for trying to justify the use of the weaponry they're given. I mean, for God's sake, you can understand why they want to feel that what they used wasn't an irresponsible weapon. But that's our job, to make sure our soldiers are given responsible weaponry to fight with. There's absolutely nothing that you do with cluster munitions, and certainly not with landmines, that you couldn't do with unitary weapons. And that, yes, certainly some of them don't explode, but I can get up with you and we can stand on a 500-pound bomb and we can dance a fandango. Nothing will happen to it. So, maybe we'll have to agree to disagree, and let's keep in touch by email if you like, and I'll keep talking about the issues with you. Yeah.
Actually, I want to just take a minute to share. My parents are from Greece, and I visited Greece a lot, especially when I was a child. And when we went up into the mountains, I was told, you can't walk here because there are landmines. And a lot of the older folks now that knew where the landmines are dying off, So if I were to go back to Greece now, to my parents' village, it's like I'm terrified. I think about this actually quite a bit. Will I step on a landmine? So that was like my first introduction to that. And that's a very, very scary thing, like stepping on something and being exploded years after it was planted. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because that was my first thing. But what I want to ask you real quickly is I was wondering, the pictures you showed with the bomb and opening up with those mines, are those the same that were used by the Israelis in Lebanon?
Okay, they were cluster munitions. They used a mixture of cluster munitions, quite a strange mixture. They used artillery and missile based, and they also dropped some from aircraft. Some of it was quite strange. They used Blue 63s, which were out of date when the US used them in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. And in fact, we were quite surprised to see them because as far as we knew, the US were destroying them. Not sure how they got to Israel. Perhaps it was a mistake in addressing or something. Perhaps they were going to be destroyed. But, of course, there were huge failure rates among them. But then you had M77s, which are basically small submunitions that come out of rockets, multiple launch rocket systems. And you had M85s, which had been bought by a number of European countries, including my own, on the basis that the Israeli military industries had told them that this had a 0.06% failure rate. And they said, well, that's okay then. I would not send them out to buy a second-hand car for me. You know, you go there, you go in and you say, is that car okay? Wow, yeah, this is a fantastic car. Yeah, no, the window's just open. Don't worry, the window's just open because we wanted to get some air in it. And, I mean, you've got to be crazy. You listen to the manufacturers. Of course, what happened when the Israelis used it, it was shown with self-destruct, it was shown to have between an 8 and 12% failure rate. Without self-destruct, about a 20 to 25% failure rate. In that very short period of time, they denied 26% of usable agricultural land to the southern Lebanese. Now tell me how that improves security, and how does that stop people supporting the people who are firing rockets into Israel? I'd have thought it would have done the opposite, and so do most people. So, I mean, they fired 4 million in. It's going to take us a few years to clear them.
Was that the U.S. selling them those weapons?
No. They made, I mean, the 63, I don't know where they... No, nobody needs to sell the Israelis weapons. They have their own very efficient manufacturers. They made the M85 and they sold it around the world. My country said they didn't buy any. What they did was kind of interesting. They gave British Aerospace some money, and British Aerospace paid Israeli military industries several $1 million more than they would have normally paid, so that they could subcontract to manufacture them themselves, but they magically manufactured them overnight just after a large number of planes had landed from Israel. So I'm not sure quite how that happened, but essentially, yes, we bought them from them. And now, of course, we've got the embarrassment of a whole load of cluster munitions that even without a ban, the government could never use. So we've let down the soldiers, even if they were good weapons, because even if generically they were good weapons, because we bought a load of rubbish from the Israelis that they couldn't possibly use after what happened in Lebanon. Doesn't make good economic sense, military sense, or anything else. Yes, David.
I wonder if you could talk a little more about the campaign, and what I'm particularly interested in is, even on smaller scales, it's often difficult to hold a bunch of very independent-minded, creative people together working toward the same goal. And you've managed, in some ways, to do that, you know, across cultures, countries, political divides, and so on and so on. So I wonder if you could talk about sort of the decision-making processes, and how do you kind of move forward?
Okay, I think the first thing is that it's the diversification of skills, of knowledge, of enthusiasm, of different ways of working, different languages. It's those things that make the campaign effective. Even the suggestion to somebody like Jody Williams that somehow people like me control Jody would probably get you an answer that you wouldn't expect from a lady. We didn't control each other. We, to use one of those awful words that is always used now, we celebrated everybody's individuality. But we all agreed to follow a general pattern because we'd agreed one thing, that as a general rule, what we were doing was representing the communities that we worked in. So people in Africa and Asia, who couldn't get up and speak, who didn't have that voice. And that limited us to some extent, not to just go off and do our own thing, not to include other issues, not to make this a broader kind of disarmament. We had some people, who came in and tried, and yes, there was a certain amount of what you might call mild humanitarian discipline in dealing with those guys. But in general, it wasn't that hard. One of the reasons is this. When you talk about 1,200 organizations in the ICBL, or at the moment 250 organizations or more than 250 in the Cluster Munition Coalition, you're not talking about thousands of people doing the day-to-day work. A lot of people are all doing small things around the world which are adding to the main body. You have a group of people who give a lot of time or all of their time at different times. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring out the different skills that people have. And what we're doing a lot in the cluster munition campaign, because, of course, us old campaigners are getting older and one day we're going to die off. We want to make sure that we pass on these skills to younger campaigners. The way I've always defined it is this kind of campaigning you could kind of call guerrilla campaigning. You want to be a little bit of a chameleon as a campaign. You should always engage in dialogue, and honestly, with manufacturers, with governments, with the military. And look for that dialogue, and have an honest dialogue. Have disagreements, argue with them, and listen to what's being said. And take it in. Go away and research, see if they're right. Because if they're right, maybe you're wrong. Deal with that honestly. But then, because it gives you confidence when you do find that you are right despite what's being said. But then, at the same time, make some very public rules. Make sure all the governments who disagree with you know what your rules are. And as soon as they know what your rules are, change them. It's a good way to work. The other thing is we've never accepted off-the-record briefings. Whenever and it keeps going on, and you think they'd learn because I've written about this, but I very often go into a meeting like just recently with the Australian government, and it's the second time I've done it in Australia, and at the beginning of the meeting, one of the diplomats there said, of course, this is off the record. And I haven't said anything. And then the second time, not the first time, but the second time, one of them said, so Ray, you agree it's off the record? I said, well, if it's off the record for you, then I think that's very good. I think you should stick by that. And they accepted that because they wanted to talk. But what gives me a right to go and listen to something that you don't know? You know, why should I be told something by the Australian government that most Australian people in the street don't know? To me, that's not democracy. They're not telling me some military secrets. What they're trying to do is pacify me and get me onto their side. They're playing their own campaign game. And they shouldn't be, because they're government in a democracy. Not only that, they're unelected officials. And so in those situations, I normally have the press lined up outside. And we already have a meeting with the press. And that's how we announced to the Australian people that their two senior military planners back in 1996 were their major plan for the use of anti-personnel mines was to lay them in Australia. I think the phones of the radio station just about melted down. Having said that, meetings with Chatham House rules, we abide by absolutely. Because that's a dialogue, that's a different thing. That's where you can listen, let governments express their concerns, their feelings, make their arguments in an environment where you know that that's not going to be used against them. That's fair enough, because Chatham House rules allow you to talk about it. They just don't allow you to identify the person or the delegation that was saying it. That's fair enough. But I would say about campaigning, you've got to be imaginative. It can't be a hobby, but it should be good fun sometimes, because otherwise it will drive you crazy.
Well, I think maybe we'll cut it off there. Ray, maybe you can take a couple of questions down front, and we'll give people that need to get going a chance to get going. Why don't we say thank you to Ray? Thanks very much.